And for that, I'm very pleased to welcome, for a look at some of the challenges and opportunities with this, I'd like to welcome Dr. Claire Nelson from Columbia University. She's also the co-founder and chief technology officer for Cella, which actually removes CO2 and turns it into rock for safe and permanent storage. So Claire, the floor is now yours. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Climeworks for hosting this summit. So, as Hannah just said, we're going to talk today about M.R.V, which hopefully everyone knows what that is and why it's important, but just in case people still have lingering doubts, we have an excellent panelists here today to share with you their insights. So I'm Dr. Claire Nelson. I'm the co-founder and chief technology officer of Cella, and we do in situ mineralization for permanent carbon storage, and I'm also a research scientist at Columbia. So we'll take a minute for our panelists to introduce themselves and their organizations, starting with you, Ted.
Yeah, thank you. And firstly, I just want to say a big thank you to Climeworks for organizing this. It's really great to have an event to bring everyone together, and big shout out to Tristan and Julie who put this all together. Yeah, I'm Ted. I'm director of carbon removal at B0 Carbon. My background's really in the policy world. I used to run the climate research at a think tank in London called Onward. And I actually had this, one of the light bulb moments that got me into CDR when I was there was actually a conversation with Christoph Butler. I don't think I've actually ever told him that, back in sort of 2020 when I was doing a lot of work on future tech innovation and industrial decarbonization, and then got into this. And so I'm now at B0 Carbon, which is a global carbon credit ratings agency for the voluntary carbon market. We rate carbon credits from everything from avoided deforestation through to direct air capture. And the real sort of purpose behind the mission of the company at the beginning was that there was this lack of correlation between price and quality in the voluntary carbon market. And that market failure was really stifling a lot of things in the market. And so the rating is to really try and cut through that. And we see the market not as a binary market of a sort of a credit or not a credit, but actually more like a bond market where there's a huge variation in quality within it. So yeah, really excited to be here today.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Anu. I lead the Science and Innovation program at Carbon 180. For those of you who might not be familiar, Aaron briefly mentioned, Carbon 180 is the first and only US federal policy NGO focused exclusively on carbon removal. And our mission is to design and champion equitable and science-based policies that bring carbon removal to gigaton scale, safely, responsibly, quickly. And that's why I'm really excited to be on this panel today, because I think the thing that lives at the intersection of equitable and science-based actions in the carbon removal industry is really accountability. And M.R.V is the tool we use to get to accountability.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Natalia Dorfman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Kita. Kita is a carbon insurance company, and our purpose is using insurance as an enabler to drive more financing to help scale high-quality carbon removal solutions. And clearly, as we'll talk about more in the panel today, M.R.V is core to that in terms of enabling us and the wider financial services industry the data to do these insurance products, and also to help build the trust that will enable and unlock that level of financing.
Fantastic, thank you. So let's start with what constitutes high-quality M.R.V, and really what is it? So it sounds like it could be pretty technical, but really it's just accounting. So Anu, could you please just tell us what is M.R.V and the various aspects of a removal that should be accounted for?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this question. If you've been forced to interact with me in the last year, you know that I'm sort of obsessed with what is M.R.V. So I think on a really basic level, M.R.V is the robust quantitative accounting of a carbon removal project that enables accountability. In most contexts, we talk about this as accountability between buyers and suppliers, so you know that you're getting what you paid for. But at Carbon 180, we believe this is also accountability between project developers and host communities so that they know that they're getting what they signed up for. And similarly, we believe that carbon removal is a public good. It will be largely publicly financed in the long term. And that means we also need to think about accountability for the public. Are we getting, as a society, as a community, the removal service that we believe we're getting? So really, the big picture is robust quantitative accounting. And the first message that I really want to kind of drill home here is that we can figure this out. Accounting exists in other industries. This is a thing that people know how to do. Carbon removal is hard in some unique ways, but it's very doable. And we're starting to see with, for example, the work that Climeworks is doing with the first third-party verified tons, that we're going to move towards this solution, and it's very doable. That said, I think since we're having a whole panel on M.R.V, I want to dig a little bit deeper below this sort of surface level of what is M.R.V. And I think there's 4 important steps to consider in this process. The first is standards. The standard tells you what are you trying to accomplish. It's your target outcome. Then you have protocols. If the standard is the what, the protocol is the how. How are you actually going to do this? What are the steps that you take? After that, you have project implementation. So you're actually doing the work according to the protocol. And then you have outcome assessment. So did you actually do carbon removal? And each of these steps requires some degree of validation and verification. So is this standard fit for the purpose that you set out? Did the protocol actually meet the standard? Did you do the project according to the protocol? And did you get the outcomes that you said you got? And I wanted to outline these steps to emphasize my second sort of main point, that M.R.V is an ecosystem problem with an ecosystem solution. It's not just going to be one entity that comes in as like, we did M.R.V, check the box. It's really going to be a number of different entities, and that's great because there's tons of opportunities to bring in expertise from other fields. And that's why I'm super excited to be on stage with Natalia and Ted, because they're building some of these solutions in this ecosystem.
Thank you. That was a really robust and detailed explanation of the what behind M.R.V. What is it? So you mentioned something about like it's an ecosystem problem, but just breaking that first M into 2 subset M's, that it stands for monitoring, but kind of within that is measurement. So this is a DAC summit, and I think Jan mentioned earlier that DAC has a little bit of a leg up in terms of a straightforward pathway to accounting, but not all removal solutions can say the same. So within specifically that measurement part of the M, how do we account for differences in both our scientific ability to measure and also the uncertainties? So maybe I'll ask Ted, because your organization rates different approaches. So how do you define high quality for a given solution?
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth, I don't think everyone will be that familiar with carbon credit ratings. So how we fit into this puzzle is a bit like if you're looking at the bond market, you've got, as you said, M.R.V is basically accountants and auditors, right? So there's that side of it. In the bond market, you've then got insurance, and then you've then got ratings agencies. And I see this market, the sort of VCM, and within that, the CDR market, really as a similar makeup to that. So it is a slightly different part of the ecosystem to M.R.V. We are, and the M.R.V providers really create that credit, they certify that credit, and then we are really putting our opinion on the likelihood that that carbon credit returns a ton of carbon removed or avoided. And so within that, our framework really looks at a number of factors. Additionality is really important. Overcrediting is really important. Non-permanence risk is crucial. Things like policy, things like leakage, all of these things feed into the public methodology that we've got that feeds into our ratings methodology. And in our eyes is a really key part about how you look at the carbon efficacy of these carbon credits. But it's also worth noting that we also have a barrier to entry. There's not all credits are rateable. In the voluntary carbon market, we've got about a fifth are unrateable credits because they have poor transparency, poor disclosure. Within the ex-post, so the sort of retirable CDR market, engineered CDR market, almost no credits are rateable. And we are working, day in, day out, working with registries, working with developers, really trying to push that disclosure and transparency requirement. Because I think if we don't get that right, some of these issues we've seen in the avoidance market will be sort of perpetuated again in this market. And I'm really concerned that if we don't get that right now, then we might follow some of those similar pitfalls. But that criteria that we want a third-party verification of the LCA, so we don't say certain people, because it's a fast-evolving space, so it could be DNV, we could be looking at isometric, it could be Puro, but we need a third-party validation of the LCA. We need all of the data that's being used to feed into the rating to be in the public domain, and that is for the ex-post market, and that is a really crucial point that I was touching on. And then thirdly, an additionality test. So for us, that is the that's the framework, that's the criteria to get rated. And then the last point is really when we're looking at M.R.V. And we're looking at it within that framework, what are the sort of things that we spot out for? Because as you said, it varies hugely between methods. If you're looking at an enhanced rock weathering company, the M.R.V. practices are significantly different for direct air capture. But within that, there are a number of areas that we look at, such as we want to see conservative emissions calculations that are being used. We want to see really an evaluation of the life cycle of emissions, sort of cradle to grave. We really want to be able to see where they are, and if they're not being put in the PDD or the documentation, we want to know why that is and where that is. And then on the monitoring point that you were touching on, we really want to see robust protocols and frequency of monitoring throughout the process. But it really is, it's difficult to say, trying to put DAC and ocean alkalinity enhancement in the same breath is a very challenging thing when looking at M.R.V. But it is, we can't do our job if the proper accounting, auditing, aka the M.R.V., isn't done. And so we really think it is critical to get robust M.R.V., and then that is when ratings and insurance can really come into play and help scale this market.
Great. That was a great segue to my next question to Natalia. So yeah, you mentioned something about the data being in the public domain, and I think transparency is so crucial. We can all agree that we need trust in this industry, like Marcus said earlier. But also, the panel is called How It Matters in More Than One Way. So let's kind of shift gears and talk about how we can leverage high-quality M.R.V. To finance some of these things. So could you tell us, Natalia, about your perspective and why M.R.V. matters from a financial perspective, and more about your insurance?
Yes, of course. There's a few aspects to that question. So I guess first let me say why it matters high level from a financing perspective. Second, I can talk about how it matters from an insurance perspective. And third, I think I'd like to touch a bit on that uncertainty point, because I think that actually does also play very much into financing and different financing mechanisms. But first, at a high level, I think one great thing about the CDR industry is that there's many people coming from other industries and looking to bring in the experience of other industries into helping scale this one. And so thus, it comes as no surprise whatsoever that in order to enable financing in any industry, the base level of what you need is transparent data that is auditable and that has third-party verification. Right? Without that, you are going to immediately hit a block on any significant form of financing, and that is obviously M.R.V. From the insurance perspective then, when we're looking at what we are able to insure, you always need data and you always need third-party verification. It doesn't matter what type of insurance it is. It could be car insurance. If someone hits your car and you tell the insurance company, they're going to need to see some pictures of the damage of your car. They're going to need to see a mechanic's report. They don't just trust your word for it. In carbon removal, the type of data we need to be able to insure you depends on what we're insuring. If I was insuring political risk, M.R.V. doesn't really matter. In all honesty, I need to know what country you're in, what engagement you've had with the government, et cetera. But for what KITA does and carbon removal specific insurance, I'd say what we do right now is insure delivery risk. So we're looking at a carbon removal project at the point at which it's forecasting its expected carbon sequestration over coming years. And we're trying to assess what is the likelihood that that carbon actually gets removed from the atmosphere. So M.R.V. is key to that, both in terms of the initial data quality assessment, like do we know enough about this project to be able to assess it and insure it, going to what Ted said. But then even more importantly in a way, because even with bad data, we could insure you theoretically, it would just be very expensive. But what we can't do is pay a claim, because if we don't have a third party that at the point of that loss, our client comes to us and says, I've had a loss, I haven't received the carbon that I expected, and there's no third party that can validate that loss, there's too many conflicts of interest, because we can't be the ones who say there's been a claim. Our client can't be the one who says there's been a claim. The seller of carbon can't be the one who says there's a claim. There's too many conflicts across those three parties, so we need a third-party verifier. And I think that's great where Climeworks has come to, the ability to have third-party verified carbon credits. But that's clearly something we haven't yet cracked across the wider spectrum of carbon removal technologies. And then I suppose that brings me to the third point of uncertainty. I think uncertainty isn't necessarily a bad thing. We all deal with different levels of uncertainty on a daily basis. Where uncertainty becomes a bad thing is where there's no parameters to that uncertainty. If you are just uncertain, it stops decision making. And finance at the end of the day is a decision. right? Whether it's insurance or the investment, somebody has looked at the data and they have made a decision of whether or not to proceed with this project. And if you have too much uncertainty, you can't make that decision. And so one, I guess, sort of report that I quite like in terms of looking at uncertainty is from Frontier and Carbon Plan. And I recognize some people from those organizations might be here, so apologies if I mess this up. But my interpretation of it is it's giving parameters for how buyers can look at uncertainty so they can make an educated decision. And so you look at it at a high level of 3 categories. So one is looking at these uncertainty parameters. What is the impact on the likelihood of carbon removal? So if I'm a biochar producer and I'm looking at this feedstock versus this feedstock, what impact could that decision have on my ability to remove carbon? High, medium, low, negligible. What is the type of uncertainty that we're talking about? Is it execution uncertainty, so the ability of that specific carbon project to execute, versus scientific uncertainty, like the science is not yet clear, versus a sort of counterfactual uncertainty? How certain am I that without my investment in this project that it would happen, et cetera, et cetera? How certain am I that that feedstock wouldn't be used for another purpose? And then finally, whose responsibility is it to deal with that uncertainty? Is it the project's responsibility, or is it that sort of systemic-wide responsibility that we all need to work together to improve the science? Clearly, from a financial perspective, when you can get the uncertainty parameters so that they're more geared to project-level uncertainty around execution risk, it's a much easier thing to ensure than it is scientific uncertainty with a systemic problem. And then I think we can touch on this more in terms of financing, but the other thing I liked from that report was then building down those uncertainty parameters into 2 types of carbon you can buy, which are, they termed exploration mode. So I am investing in this project, recognizing that there's uncertainty, but understanding that we need to be fostering innovation. But I recognize I might not receive a carbon credit, and I've come to terms with that, versus ton mode, which is where the uncertainty has been mitigated. Like, you're pretty certain that you should receive this carbon unless there is an execution problem, and thus those ton mode projects are the ones that can start to be scaled up and can start to receive that significant type of project financing that I think the market very much needs.
Thank you so much for those fantastic points. There's a lot that I personally want to say about that, but I'm sure that you guys both have stuff to add as well. So maybe we'll start with the project execution uncertainty piece and go to Ted, because I know that's something you're thinking about.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you were saying there, and that uncertainty point it feeds exactly into a new product that we actually launched yesterday, which is our ex-ante rating. So for those that are not familiar with us, to date, we've done ex-post credit ratings for the voluntary carbon market, and now we will be able to do the ex-ante market. And I think for people in this room, that is particularly exciting because, as we all know, it's 98% of the credits being bought are undelivered credits, and there is a real need to start to properly price and manage risk in this market. When we look at what Stripe, Shopify, Frontier, and Microsoft have done, they've kickstarted this industry into life, and it has been an incredible thing, and applause to everyone who works at those companies that has done that. But if we're being brutally honest, this market is not really alive yet, right? Like it's not getting that big project financing that we want to see for big infrastructure projects across the board. Obviously, Climeworks done a terrific job at raising capital, but it's not got a proper correlation between price and quality. There are a number of uncertainties in this market that if we want to move from the marketing budget to the treasury budget, if we want to move from the Kickstarter campaigns by Stripe and Shopify through to the biggest banks in the world, I think they really need to have a way of pricing that risk. And so that is what this ex-ante credit rating will do. We talked a bit about M.R.V ratings and insurance. Actually, Natalia and I did a report on basically this, which we call the 3 pillars of integrity in the market. And I genuinely do believe if we can get the robust M.R.V, we can get ratings, and in this case, ex-ante ratings, because that is where this market is living at the moment, and we can get proper insurance, that is the model that the bond market scaled to $123 trillion value. That is a model to follow that can really help boost this market. For us, our ratings, our clients, our main clients are some of the biggest energy companies in the world. We've got 4 out of the 5 biggest banks in the world using our rating to inform their investment decisions. And so when they will look at, we're already getting orders for these ex-ante credit ratings, we really hope that will help unlock the capital that's needed and move us from that early stage through to that next phase. And the key sort of differentiator between the ex-post credit rating and what we're doing now is this sort of core element of project execution risk. Obviously, let's not kid ourselves. This industry is very nascent, and there is, a lot of the time it's first of its kind projects that we're doing. So there is a lot of project execution risk in the things that we are doing, and so factoring that into the rating is going to be really, really important. But crucially, how we're going to be communicating that is, firstly, the reports will be private ratings, so we'll be discussing about what circulation we do between us and the person that's doing the rating. That could be a developer, that could be a buyer. But it's also the project execution risk is really going to be important in allowing those banks or those big institutional investors to properly price that cost of capital. And as we're talking about that uncertainty, if they can price in that uncertainty, I think that is hugely beneficial for this industry. And so I'm really excited to be launching it, and we've got a sort of a big year ahead at sort of rolling this out. But hopefully some of you can be involved. But it'd be great to touch base with anyone. I'll be out there later if anyone's interested in hearing more. But hopefully that sort of feeds into how we're thinking about this stuff.
And I would add just one thing on the sort of nexus of quality, uncertainty, and funding. From the policy perspective, the US federal government has a pretty robust toolkit to look at pathways at different levels of development, so it's not all direct purchasing. So if you think about the things that DOE, the government as a whole, is doing, particularly with the recent climate legislation, Inflation Reduction Act, we have R&D funding for really nascent pathways, but also to help reduce those systemic scientific uncertainties that Natalia spoke to. And then we have demonstration support, so something like a direct air capture hub where you have cost share for demonstration projects. Then we have support financing commercial scale deployment through things like the Loan Programs Office. We have M.R.V. infrastructure support, so we have something like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which creates measurement infrastructure that can support on M.R.V. And then you have kind of tax incentives and direct purchasing for those, and tons of removal. So thinking about the market, but also thinking about this robust pipeline of tools that we have through policy, through government, to support the entire ecosystem.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. And congrats, Ted, on the launch of that ex-ante rating. So going back to what Natalia said about the scientific uncertainty, and Anu, I kind of wanted to ask you to elaborate on this a bit, is that you mentioned how there's different pathways in the kind of public sector and government space that we can leverage M.R.V. to really scale. But just kind of backing up a little bit on the scientific uncertainty piece. So I'm a scientist, and I'm also on the supply side of carbon removal, and there seems to be this race to get M.R.V. quality as high as possible. And so right now, I think a lot of the tech is just climbing this curve up, but hopefully at some point we'll level off as these technologies mature. But of course, the different approaches have different rates at which they'll reach that kind of plateau. So how can we account for the differences in quality today without discouraging the kind of lower level, I guess the more nascent technologies that have a long way to go scientifically from evolving and scaling?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start there. And actually, I'm going to pull on another thread that Natalia raised, which is the work that Carbon Plan is doing on uncertainties and differentiating different purposes for our tons of removal. I think really the key thing here is that M.R.V. regimes, particularly standards, need to be fit for purpose. So if your purpose is one-to-one accounting of residual fossil emissions, that's a specific standard. If your purpose is perhaps exploration mode, beyond value chain mitigation, supporting a broader portfolio of climate solutions, managing large-scale carbon reservoirs, those are different purposes with different standards. And I think there's coming back to the sort of portfolio of solutions and M.R.V. as a whole, we need to be thinking about reducing scientific uncertainty, getting the best possible M.R.V. we can, but also thinking about what are we trying to accomplish, and what is the standard in the M.R.V. that is fit for that purpose? And I think there will be different purposes in the overall market and the portfolio.
Natalia, would you like to add anything to that as well, since you brought up?
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to add to that. I mean, I agree on the fit for purpose. I also agree, of course, we need to be scaling up. I think I agree on the point that we need to scale up M.R.V. and then it will hit a plateau at some point. I think where we will, at that future point, need to come, I suppose, to some kind of compromise, which might cause challenges or disagreement in the industry, but where we need to get to is a more systematic and scalable form of M.R.V. Right? So right now, when you have your buyers that are, broadly speaking, catalyzing these solutions, but I would say, broadly speaking, not really expecting necessarily a return. They sort of have the potential. They've understood they might make a loss, but they're looking to catalyze the industry. But they do a lot of due diligence on these projects, right? When you look at the due diligence that these buyers do, it is intense, and it is not scalable, and you can't expect those mid-market adopters, which is what we need, to do that kind of due diligence. And so we need to get the ability of M.R.V. to be scalable and more systematic in order to bring in more buyers. I think that will inherently come with a compromise in terms of the, I guess, quality of that M.R.V. And I think that's where the industry will probably have some forms of conflict, where what is the sort of level that is a high level, but an acceptable level, at which point we can make it more systematic in order to bring in more people. And I think we'll always have a debate to some extent, with some people wanting that to be higher, but we will have to come to a compromise because we can't have this really expectation that each individual buyer does all of this due diligence before they engage in the market. It's just too slow. I don't have a view on where that level should be, but it's probably, I mean, from our perspective, I think ratings and insurance, we don't really have a horse in the race in terms of who we want to win if there's any particular type or any particular company. We're just there to be a supportive mechanism. And I think to help lay out some of the risk frameworks and data points that we will need to be able to insure projects, which might be able to influence some of the wider conversations.
Have anything to add to that?
No, I think I will just say, I mean, that the challenge with trying to make consistent M.R.V. practices is, as we were talking about, so variable. We're talking about these methods that are sort of so dissimilar, but we kind of clump them all in the same list that we've all got, and think, how can we make something that works for everyone? Which I think, in practice, if you're looking at enhanced rock weathering, you're going to need maybe a water sample, maybe a soil sample, maybe a sort of gas sample. I mean, there's so many different, there's so many nuances to some of these technologies that I think it's going to be a real challenge. But yeah, as Natalia mentioned, we are kind of agnostic on who is doing that work. We are there to really use that data, and we will be judging the robustness of the M.R.V. through that process, but really here to be collaborators more than anything else.
Interesting. Yeah, Natalia, you brought up something about setting like the high bar, and who sets that? Is it the buyers? Is it the science? And Anu, like, what role does the public sector play in that, in the political framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, just to kind of build on the points that we've already discussed, I do think there should be a really high bar. As you've heard from Aaron, we don't believe carbon removal is an excuse to continue emitting. We're really trying to decarbonize as rapidly as possible, and then also have carbon removal in our toolkit. So we want a really high standard for what counts as carbon removal. In terms of the policy and public benefit piece of it, I think it comes back to this theme around accountability. Accountability, you're going to hear me say accountability over and over again. And to be more specific, I think when you implement a policy and you're trying to achieve a specific goal, it's really important to be able to demonstrate that you actually did that thing. So if we're funding carbon removal, if we're funding DAC hubs, and we're saying we're building megaton facilities, we need to demonstrate that we're removing megatons of carbon from the air. And what that enables, particularly in the early stage of the market, is more ambitious policy going forward, right? Because 1 megaton facility isn't where we want to end up. In 2050, we want gigatons of removal. And doing M.R.V. well now enables that. And so I've heard here a few times, and you'll probably hear it again, what we need in the near term is demonstrations of CDR projects that we can show people and say, hey, it's working. I would agree with that, and I would say yes, and we need those projects to have unassailable M.R.V. that is really trustworthy, that is transparent, that is accessible to communities. So we're not only demonstrating the technology, but we're building the trust along the way and saying, this is working, we're doing what we're saying, and we're laying the groundwork for a really robust M.R.V. ecosystem.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about how we need kind of airtight M.R.V. at this stage to really enable growth and scaling. So I'm just curious about what pathways that actually looks like. Like, how can we leverage robust, airtight M.R.V. today to actually get us to scale this industry? So maybe let's start with you, Natalia. Like, what financial pathways exist that can actually catapult this forward?
I think on that, I'll go back to the earlier point on the exploration mode tons and then the ton mode tons. Because I think they matter greatly in terms of the financing paths. I think the majority of the financing now is that exploration mode ton, and that is your grants, it's your VC funding, it's your small pre-purchase agreements. It's very positive to enable innovation, but it doesn't scale the market. You need, I think, those exploration mode tons to get to that unassailable level of M.R.V., or at least a level in which we have a high or well understood uncertainty level that we can price into our purchases, and then you get to that ton mode ton. And I think, our goal from Kita, when we were looking at this market, to some extent, we're trying to develop insurance that works with the market today, forward purchasing and sort of one-off purchases, but we're also trying to be flexible as insurance can be, to be there for when that larger level project financing, debt financing type structures start to emerge, because you don't get that without insurance. But I think you need the ton modes so that those large investors, that significant finance, can trust what they're buying. They can convince their CFO and their procurement and their risk and their board that actually they're making a strong investment and that they understand the return that they're going to get on their investment, and that they have protection in place in case that investment doesn't pan out. And so I know I'm not taking into account here government sort of public financing, in large part because right now our focus is on private sector. And you can probably speak much more in terms of the government level financing, which is also obviously going to be very, very important. But in terms of that private sector financing, once we've gotten out of that exploration mode into the ton mode, I think insurance will be a huge enabler to get in that just significant institutional capital.
Yeah, what this boils down to, I think we probably all agree, is that M.R.V. is the crucial piece of the puzzle we need to get right for any of this to be unlocked. Whether it is ratings, whether it's insurance, whether it's getting all of that private sector institutional investment into these solutions, or if it is the public sector as well. We're not going to do any of this. The governments are not going to pile in behind all of these consistently for time to come. They're not going to go into the emissions trading schemes in the UK and EU if we don't sort out M.R.V. In what world do we have direct air capture in an emissions trading scheme where the M.R.V. hasn't been sorted out? So I think at the end of the day, it is just pivotal for all of these different parts that are moving.
Great. Yeah, I think we covered a lot, why it matters, and in terms of unlocking financing, and also how it's important for technologies and suppliers, but also buyers. But Anu, could you just talk about who is M.R.V. for, other than what's already been talked about? What are the other stakeholders that we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this question as well. So we've talked quite a bit about how M.R.V. unlocks finance. It allows us to have the appropriate risk management tools within the industry. But there's also this huge piece around trust that we have touched on recently. And we think of that largely as, of course, the market piece, but trust with communities, trust with people who have been harmed by extractive industries in the past. And now we're trying to come in with a new industry and say this one is going to fix things. We need to think about trust with the public and with taxpayers who will, to some extent, be funding this or supporting this work. And we need to think about trust really broadly, globally, in carbon removal as a solution. And I think the really only way we build that trust is to have good M.R.V., to have receipts. M.R.V. is the receipts that says we did the thing that we said we were going to do. And one way that I think we could think about this that is a little bit uncommon, but I'll pitch it to you all, is M.R.V. is a tool for accountability, which is a step on the path to achieving more just outcomes in the CDR sector. And if you think about it that way, M.R.V. then becomes a tool for achieving more just outcomes. And you can ask different questions when you think of M.R.V. this way. You can ask not just how do I build in transparency for financial institutions, but how do I build in data accessibility for communities so they can see what's happening in a project? How do I build in measurement not just of the pure carbon aspects, but of environmental aspects that are extremely important to communities that are going to host these solutions, and make sure that that is in the package of M.R.V. How do I build in direct community-based monitoring, for example, to build trust, again, more directly? And I think when you think about M.R.V. as a tool for achieving more just outcomes, you arrive at a more robust and rigorous accounting of what a CDR project is doing in a way that today and going forward is really going to build trust, and that trust is necessary to unlock scale.
Thank you. I think that was a really great way to conclude this panel, and I'm sure you all have so much more to say on this topic, so we're going to take some time for questions right now, but if anyone doesn't get to ask their question, find them later, because they all are industry leaders and have a lot of really important insights. So I'll turn it over to Hannah now to take questions.
Thank you so much. Indeed. Do we have questions here in the room? I know that we have one right at the very front. Any more takers? And one here. So first, we'll go to the front. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a fascinating and important panel. I'm really glad you're here. You talked about a great number of things that I care about. The one topic you didn't really tackle is who pays. Who pays for M.R.V.? Right now, that's all falling on the project developer's shoulders solely. Do you have thoughts on this?
In my view, at the end of the day, it will go through to customer pays. So I think we are sort of agnostic in exactly the device in which that happens. I know some newer carbon removal registries are doing it in different ways. Some are making it that the payer pays, some are making it that the developer pays. We are a kind of third party in this, so happy with any model, but I do think the voluntary carbon market to date has really worked on the assumption that the developer pays, and so I think trying to rewire that whole process might be a challenging thing to tackle, but I'd be interested to know what you both think.
No, I agree. I think the cost gets passed on at the end of the day to the buyer and the cost of the carbon credit. And if we can price that uncertainty, or if you look at it from the flip side, price the quality of the M.R.V., so price the level of trust. I think if a buyer is saying, I'm buying this ton of carbon, or I'm financing this facility such as that it removes a ton of carbon, the certainty that they have actually removed a ton of carbon is what they are paying for. And if they want to be certain that their financing has actually had that impact, they should pay more. And if that's the instance, then if the seller of carbon can price that sort of confidence level into the carbon, then they should be able to, in essence, get this buyer to pay for the M.R.V. would be my perspective on how with the financing, the sort of profitability of it should play out.
One thing that I would add to this, I love this question. I think a lot about financial incentives. And so the question I have is not only who pays, but what is the payment structure? And what do those financial incentives imply for the integrity of the market? I think we're all familiar with some of the stuff that's happened in the voluntary market, and we don't want to see in the durable removals market. And specifically, there's a few things that I think we should be looking at critically within this structure of who's doing what and who's paying them to do it. Volume-based transactions. I was just having lunch with an environmental economist who was saying, imagine if Moody's rated bonds based on how many got paid based on how many got a good rating. That would probably not be the best system. So volume-based transactions is something we want to look at. And then also a high degree of vertical integration in M.R.V. steps, where you can press a lot of levers in order to drive down costs, but also to drive up your margins. So thinking about financial incentives within M.R.V., not just who pays and where does the cost end up, but how are these payments structured such that we are maximizing public benefit and minimizing the risk of fraud.
Maybe if I can just jump in, because there's a great question that's actually come in from our audience online, which is related to this. It's not, who pays, but how much do they pay? How much does high-quality M.R.V. cost in a CDR portfolio? I wonder if this is even a possible answer.
Pass.
I'll answer this. I love this question.
Please go ahead.
I think we shouldn't be thinking of M.R.V. separately from the cost of a ton of removal. It's just baked in. If you can't verify that you did the removal, then how can you sell it? So M.R.V. is just part of the baked-in ton, the cost. And so if you're selling a ton of removal at 600, 500, 400, 300 going down, your M.R.V. is also improving alongside the other parts of your CapEx, OpEx, all of the things that we heard about earlier today. It's baked in. It's not a separate cost.
Yeah, that's very interesting indeed. We have another question on the floor.
Hi, I'm Francis Robson from Hitachi Energy. I'm quite new to this whole topic, so my question might make no sense at all, but I'll try anyway. You talk about ratings agencies and things like that getting involved in the ratings of the credits, and we're looking at high-quality carbon credits in the future. And what you were talking about brought to mind the film The Big Short. And so I wondered if you thought that might be a risk in the future, that when big banks and big investors get involved and there becomes more pressure on sort of return on investment and things, and then how do you maintain your sort of independence as a ratings agency and make sure that we can all trust exactly what's being rated and that the quality of the credits is as high as the rating says it is?
Yeah, someone actually asked me this at the drinks last night, and I was like, "You've definitely just watched The Big Short." But I think it's a good point. We're working in an unregulated market. The ratings agencies got regulated as a result of that after 2008. So I think lessons have been learned from those mistakes. And all I can say is we as an organisation will really work our utmost to make sure that some of those issues were not created in the past. I mean, there was instances where they used to get in 2008 sort of bundles of junk ratings and then relabeled them as a AAA rating. I mean, that sort of thing is never going to fly with our model. So, but it's an interesting point. I think as we move towards the regulated space, towards compliance markets, I think also some of those worries might be lessened.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here, actually, which is probably quite related to a question that you asked earlier, Claire. But who is the ultimate decider when it comes to M.R.V? Is it the voluntary carbon market themselves? Is it private players? Or is it even governments, that will establish and enforce M.R.V in the future?
I mean, I have to say government.
Please go for it. Please do.
I think you're the best place to take this first step.
So I think it will change over time. When we're in a voluntary market landscape, there are going to be buyers who are thinking critically about how to assess their own risk and how to protect their investments. I think, as Claire mentioned, there's a lot of scientific uncertainty. So the scientific community will play a big role in saying, hey, this is our consensus about the level of M.R.V. that is possible today. And if you hear something wildly different, don't believe them. So there's definitely a piece for the scientific community. And I think as the field matures, we move towards more compliance or regulatory mechanisms, there'll be an increasing role for the government to step in and say, this is what qualifies. So a good example of that is the EPA has M.R.V. rules and guidance for 45Q and geologic storage. So in order to access these tax subsidies, you need to meet these requirements. So I think in the long run, we're heading towards government, but I have to say that because I work on policy.
All right, thank you all so much indeed for your insights. Please take your seats back in the audience. Thank you.